Hey guys, Mike Lukic here. Thanks for joining me today, and welcome to part 2 of my How to Use GTO Plus series. If you haven't checked out part 1, I'd suggest that you go and do so. You can find the link if you're viewing this on my YouTube page. You can find the link as the last video that I created last week. If you're looking at this on my website, it was the last post I posted last week. And in that post, in that video, I walked through how to actually navigate the interface of GTO Plus and how do you actually set up and configure your initial tree. In this video, I'm going to pick up where I left off and explain in detail how to actually run a solve within GTO Plus, and then I'm going to spend the bulk of the time actually going through the equilibrium output of the solve, and I'll take a look at all of the different data points that GTO Plus spits out for the solve, but I'll also take a look at just all of the different options and different ways to actually read and interpret the data. So now we're in GTO Plus, and we're going to take a look at actually running the solve and what the output actually looks like. So I set up a tree here just to examine a spot. And I'll quickly just go through the configuration of the tree so we can all be on the same page as we're looking at the output. I chose to model a 6 max online game where the middle position, or the hijack, opens, and that's us with this range. So just under 300 combos, about 22.5% of range. Probably could be plus or minus a few percent here and there depending on the player, but this is an approximate range I might be opening the hijack with in an online 6 max game with 100 big blinds, and then we are flatted by a button with this range, and I did a lot of weighting here. So there's a portion of the range here that has full coverage and combos, but some of the range I only gave 50% of combos, whether sometimes they may be 3-betting or calling instead, some of which I only gave 25% of combos, such as like ace queen suited jacks. I think that they're going to be 3-betting those more frequently, but they might have some in their calling range there, and then I just kind of degraded that all the way down. And then some hands like nines, they might be calling more often than 3-betting, but 3-betting a little bit. And then some of these other hands like 10-8 suited, 9-7 suited, pocket fours, pocket threes, pocket deuces, they're mostly calling. Sometimes they might be folding, and some of these hands down here I have them calling or folding at some frequency here too. But again, I think the point here is that we're not going to necessarily know exactly how our opponents are playing, so we're approximating things, and I think that's good to add some level of uncertainty in when you're actually building those ranges. I chose to look at a 10-8-4 rainbow board, and just from the configuration here, we open to 2.5 big blinds. We're called in the button. Both blinds fold, so it's a 6.5 big blind pot. Effective stacks are 97.5 big blinds. I gave us options, so 2 betting options on the flop, 3 betting options on the turn, and actually 4 betting options on river. I gave our opponents just only 1 betting option in half pot, just to make it a little bit more simple. I probably could go a little bit more detailed with this, but again, it's fine for the purpose of this solve. So when I get to the point where I feel comfortable with the actual tree itself, I built my tree and I'm ready to actually solve this. The couple things I need to note here is one, this target DEV, which is essentially how accurate do we want my solution to be. when you have to realize when, and it's important to note that when we're looking at a solver output, especially at equilibrium, when there are no node locks in place, all this essentially is two computers with these preset ranges playing each other over and over and over again until they reach a point where neither can exploit one another for any significant amount. And what that amount actually is, we specify this right here. So a smaller number is more accurate. So, if we have this in here as 0.5%, what we are saying here is that neither player could exploit one another for greater than 0.5% of the pot. And when the pot is 6.5 big blinds, it means that neither player can exploit one another for greater than 0.0325 big blinds. To put that into perspective, if we're playing a 50-cent dollar game online, it means that any solution that we get, it's going to be within 3 cents of a Nash equilibrium value. As we get lower, so we could choose to go 0.25%, 0.1%, and get even more accurate here. I don't really see a need to do that in a lot of scenarios, especially not for this case today, but you really don't necessarily need to go greater accuracy than 0.5% in most scenarios. You could even go lower accuracy. So if you're looking at very, very deep stack cache games, sometimes it's okay to up this to 1% or 2%, and you can actually type that in here if you wanted to as well. The threads represent how your hardware, essentially. So what hardware that you have within your computer, the better computer that you have, the more threads that actually can be processing this at the same exact time. I happen to have a pretty good CPU, so I'm running this across 32 threads. And then finally, I can choose to store the output in basic storage, which only stores flops and then recalculates turns and rivers, or extensive storage where the turn data is fully stored and doesn't require that recalculation. So, it makes it, I usually choose extensive storage, especially when I'm looking at individual solves, because it's really just, it's a lot easier to work within, and a lot of times I'm going back and forth between flops and turn reports, etc. So when I get to a point where I feel really comfortable with this, I have my ranges, I have my board, I have my tree configurations, and I have how detailed I actually want to get to this point. I'm not going to get to a Nash equilibrium. We don't know what Nash equilibrium is, but it's a close estimate as to an equilibrium solution with these two ranges. So when I get to this point, I am going to click Run Solver, and what you'll see is the solver will start running. And you're going to see this bar go across the screen, and that's essentially going to give you the process, and it's going to show you the process by which the solution is actually running against itself. So it started off exploitable for about 80% of the pot, and it's now gotten down to a point of it's exploitable for 40% of the pot, and now 30% of the pot, and so on and so forth. And it's going to do so until it gets to a point where it's neither player can exploit one another for greater than 0.5% of the pot. So let's fast forward this a little bit, and let's take a look at our output. So now my computer finished running the solve, and you can see it ran for about 460 seconds, and we got to the point where we've solved it down to an accuracy where neither player can exploit one another for greater than 0.47% of the pot or 0.031 big blinds. So now is the point at which we can actually take a look at the solution. So the first thing that I would actually do is look at this bar up here. And there are two ways in which I can actually take a look at the tree in general. One is by starting through this bar. But first, before I do that, I'm actually going to show you the other way, the more macro way of actually looking at this tree is I can click on this button up here in the top right portion of the screen, and you see the overall tree navigation. So this first one is highlighted because this is the first node here. So you can see that these frequencies are the same. So bet 4.29 or the 2/3 pot is 3.75% of the time. Bet a third pot about 31% of range, and then check with about 65% of range here. But as I go forth, I can see this is essentially the entire flop game tree, and each of these is going to have this little card here where I can actually pick a turn and take this into various turns going forward, and so on into rivers. So I can choose to navigate the tree this way. I can actually hover over these as well too, and see some pop-ups that actually show me a little bit about the individual ranges. I find this to be not the best way to actually look at the overall ranges, but a much, much, much better way of just looking at overall frequencies. So again, I can kind of very quickly see just frequencies throughout the entire game tree. So, if I'm choosing mostly when I am betting this smaller bet size, I can see how my opponent should be responding at equilibrium. When I choose to check, I can see how my opponent should be choosing to bet at equilibrium, right? So this gives me a good sense of my overall frequencies at equilibrium for the entire game tree. So it's a good way of actually looking at the overall game tree. But what I'm going to do instead is spend most of my time just looking at the output at the kind of more micro level. So, again, I have this other way of viewing it where I can actually look at starting with this box up here. Any time you see these circles, what that represents is a different node of the game tree, and they correspond to the circles here on this tree as well too. But this is, and they represent the different players. So this is player 1, which is us, and this is our first action of the game tree, and this is where the flop actually starts. And I can do one of three things. I can either check, I can bet a third pot, or I can bet 2/3 pot. And when I do those things, it's on player 2. They're going to have a node at each of those different points, which represents what their response might be in that different scenario. But if I click on this first node here, you can see this is what the overall individual node detail looks like. So I'm going to go through this entire screen, but this screen is going to be the same for every single node. So you're going to see essentially the same information across the different nodes, just displayed differently and with respect to that specific point in the game tree. So we can see from this first node here, again, we have the option to bet 2/3 pot, 1/3 pot, or check. So we're choosing to check with basically 2/3 of our range, 65% of our range at equilibrium. The solver chooses to bet with a little over 31% of our range for a third pot, and then a small portion of our range, less than 4% of our range, bets for 2/3 pot. I would probably simplify this, to be honest with you, and rerun this solve, really eliminating the larger bet size. Anytime you kind of see such a small portion of the range betting for a larger bet size, but for the most part, the solver chooses one bet size unilaterally over the other. You can, for the most part, very frequently just simplify by bringing all of these hands into this smaller bet range without necessarily affecting your Eevee. But up here you can see the overall frequencies. And then within this screen, you can see a lot of different components of this different node. I'll start by looking at this box down here, which this box is going to give us the just overall information of our range at this point of the game tree. So we can see just what this pot looks like. So right now the pot is 6.5 big blinds. Effective stacks or our stack at this point here is 97.5 big blinds. And we would have a to call or odds if the action, if our opponent had acted first. But the fact that we haven't had an action yet, there's nothing to call, and we obviously don't have any odds. The combos represents our overall 269.5 combos and how it breaks out across the large bet size, which is blue, and that represents this blue down here. So we bet large with about 10 combos. We bet smaller, the pink, with about 85 combos, and then the large majority here turns into a check here with about 175 combos, and that's the green. You can see how that breaks out from a percent standpoint, so which these percentages will just line up with the percentages and the frequencies above. Our equity, so our range here has a slight equity advantage, so we have a 51.3% equity advantage, which means our opponent has a 48.7% equity with their range, and then we can see kind of what that each of our different betting split ranges looks like. So the larger bet range has 54% equity against our opponent's continuance range. Our smaller size bet has 55% equity against our opponent's range, and then our checking range has about 49% equity against our opponent's range. And then the same thing with Eevee. So our Eevee is 3.2, Villain's Eevee is 3.3, so Villain is earning a larger portion of this 6.5 big blinds, which means even though despite the fact that they have less than 50% equity, which means that they are over-realizing their equity. Within this, though, we earn 4.35 big blinds with our large bet size range, 4 big blinds for the smaller bet size range, and then 2.7 big blinds for the checking range here in this spot here. So we can kind of see this breakout across the different portions of our range by all of these different metrics. We have 2 icons here. So icon number 1, this is going to bring up essentially all of this data in that table right here, as well as just more. This is going to have a lot of data in here that you can essentially just copy and paste this into Excel. That's what I use this for, is I'll copy and paste this into Excel to do a little bit more further analysis if we want to do this within Excel. This second area here lets us kind of visualize a lot of the data a little bit more. So one, I can actually just see what this breaks out here is this is the first graph for all of the different hands that I have in my range, and you can kind of see I have this sorted by equity, and no surprise, we have up at the top of the screen, if you kind of look at the table on the right hand side, the 10s and have the highest equity, 8s have the second highest equity, 4s, etc. So we can see that component of things. We can also sort it by Eevee, which actually I think gives us a little bit of a better view, and you can see that there's a huge drop off between the best hands in our range, so 10s and 8s and 4s, all the way down to we get to this tier here, and this is our aces, this is our kings, this is our queens, etc. And this I find really interesting, mainly because 10s, we're making 17 big blinds with 10s, so we're making almost 3 times the size of the pot with 10s. 8s we're also making a pretty significant amount of money, and then there's actually a pretty big drop off with 4s. The reason you start seeing these drop offs is that our opponent does have some 10s in their range, but they have full 8s in their range. So there are portions of the time where we have pocket 4s and our opponent just oversets us. And that certainly can happen, and it's going to happen more so than if when we have 10s we're never overset. When we have 8s, our opponents do have 10s some portion of the time, which oversets us, and that's going to negatively impact our Eevee somewhat, albeit not that much because it doesn't happen that often. But it's what's interesting here is that hands like 10s and 8s, they're the most valuable on this board. The difference between 10s and eights over, say, fours, for example, is much, much, much bigger than the difference between like aces and kings. There's really not much of a difference between aces and kings and queens, etc. Those essentially are pretty close from an EV standpoint for us. So again, this is just a cool way of looking at it. Another way I like looking at this here is just showing equity in EV. So you kind of see equity on the x-axis and EV here on the y-axis. And you can see which hands, the ones that are performing below this blue line are the hands in which we are going to under-realize our equity. The hands above this blue line are the hands in which we are going to over-realize our equity share in the pot. So just an interesting way of actually visualizing and viewing this. But I'm going to go back to the actual note itself. So we went through this. I went through the colors of what this looks like. This is, down here is this Manhattan graph, and it's a cool way of just visualizing from the highest equity hands that we have here on the way left all the way to the lowest equity hands on the way right in our range. What our strategic action breakout looks like. So no surprise, we are betting more with the larger portion of our range, but then there are some pockets of hands. So, in here, such as hands like Queen Jack of Hearts, 40% equity. But we're going to be betting it more often because, some of these hands in here are hands with lower equity, but they're hands that can fill out bluffing ranges really, really well. So it's not always going to be the case where we're always betting our best hands and we're always checking our worst hands. There's always a good mix here, and it's going to be dependent on the actual individual combos and how they interact with the overall boards. The section here on the right hand side, this shows us our range breakout by the individual hand classes. So our sets, our two pair, our over pairs, our top pairs, etc., all the way down. And then the bottom shows us the hand classes that are like draws. So these are open-ended straight draws, gut shots, over cards. We can actually look at these in a little more detail. So let's say I wanted to study just the top pair hands. I could right click this and you kind of see this change up here. And now that I right click this, I can move my mouse around the screen and you can see just the top pair hands show up. As well as in this information box here on the left hand side, I can scroll through and only see top pair hands. So an interesting way and a good way of actually just helping to navigate things a little bit easily. Another thing I can do is I can actually look at this. I have this key here, which is F9. I can lock things. So you'll see as I hover over any individual combo, the box on the left-hand side automatically filters to what I have hovered over. But let's say I find something interesting, like I'll use Queen Jack as an example that we have here. I find this interesting. I want to look into this a little bit more, and I went over to the right hand side, and now all of a sudden everything goes back. So if I'm hovering over Queen Jack, I can actually select F9, and now I go to the right hand side and I can actually see the different components of just this Queen Jack combo and how it breaks out across the different suits. The interesting thing I think you'll see here is which is fairly unsurprising, but it's choosing to bet at some frequency with all of my Queen Jack suited hands, but it does so more often or more frequently on the instances where we have a backdoor flush draw. So Queen Jack of clubs, hearts, and diamonds, they are hands that not only do they all have gut shots right now, but they also can turn additional equity by turning a flush draw as well, giving us the opportunity to be able to barrel pretty effectively with this hand. Queen Jack of Spades doesn't have that. So, although it's only 3% less equity, it's a hand that we're going to choose to bet less frequently. And you're going to see that across the board. So if I look at hands like, ace 5, ace 6, or, some of these ace X suited hands, I choose to bet it. The solver chooses to bet at equilibrium at some frequency with the backdoor flush draw, and does not choose to do so without the backdoor flush draw. So again, just an interesting thing that you might want to look at when you're actually looking at these solver outputs. One of the things that might be confusing here is these boards are. There is nothing here when I look at this from a combo standpoint that the solver is choosing to bet at 100% frequency. It's essentially mixing everything, which, that's how the solver gets to an equilibrium strategy that can't be exploited. There's always some mixing that's going on, but it's completely impossible to actually implement this at the table. So our goal when analyzing this solution is to try to come up with just general insights for how the solver is actually constructing, and to utilize those insights and concepts in our own construction here. So things like how frequently is the solver choosing to bet versus actually check? When the solver is choosing to bet versus check, what are the types of hands in which it is actually choosing to put into betting ranges versus checking ranges more frequently? So using our top pair examples here, it's choosing to bet, for the most part, a lot of its ace-10 hands. King tens, it's choosing to bet a lot of with the backdoor, but it actually chooses to check a little bit more frequently without the backdoor. Same thing with queen 10, although even more so it's checking, and down the line. So jack 10, it's even checking more. 10-9, it's even checking more, and it's still choosing to check more so than without the backdoor flush draw than with the backdoor flush draw. But just from an overall perspective, the solver starts checking more frequently when as the hands get a little bit weaker and weaker here. So as we are constructing here, we may want to start building rules out for ourselves to say things like, maybe we want to bet all of our ace 10s, maybe we want to bet all of our king 10s, and then as we start getting down to queen 10s, that might be the cutoff for us where we choose to either check all of our queen 10s or split it based off of the backdoor flush draw and then check all of our jack 10s. Either way, how I like to start building out construction ranges is to start developing some of these insights and try to align overall frequencies of my ranges while not necessarily mixing any individual combo. The important thing to note right here, though, is this output is the equilibrium output. It is an estimate of a Nash equilibrium, but that does not necessarily mean that is the optimal way to play this scenario. All that means is that this is the optimal way to play against a completely clairvoyant opponent who also knows your strategy. And that's essentially what the solver is doing here. So player 1 and player 2 here both know each other's ranges and both iterate to the point at which neither player can unilaterally exploit the other player by doing something different. So this is a really good equilibrium strategy. It's a strategy that will do fairly well because our opponents are going to be playing differently than this player 2 here, and because this player 2 is playing an optimally against this specific strategy, any deviation from the way this player 2 is playing against this strategy is going to perform worse. So we can do well here, but that other player's strategy, depending on how far it is as a deviation from this strategy, we may be leaving a lot of money on the table by actually playing this strategy, meaning that we actually can do things a lot differently than this strategy to best exploit our opponents. And that's where node locking comes into play. And I'm not going to necessarily cover node locking today. That's going to be part of video number 3, where I'm actually going to get into the specifics of how do you actually build exploitative strategies using solvers. Moving on just the displays a little bit here. So I like to use display method 2, which actually cuts off some of these combos. So you can see some of these combos I have at 50% coverage. I could choose all at 100, which makes it a little bit easier to see, especially when you get to the point where there are some combos where we might only have 10% frequency. It's not necessarily a problem on the flops, but as you start getting into turns and rivers, as ranges get diluted, it becomes hard to read sometimes. So it's actually good to kind of sometimes see this. What does it look like if I actually show all 100, all combos at 100% frequency? But again, it can get kind of confusing. The other thing you could do is this display method 1, which instead of actually cutting things off, it fades them out a little bit. Again, this I think is a little bit tougher to read because we don't necessarily. It's hard to tell the level at which this transparency takes effect. What's the difference between 50% coverage, 75% coverage, 25% coverage? It's a lot more clear, I think, when we actually look at display method 2. And then finally, I like to look at, I'll look through this table right here. So I've been referencing this table a little bit throughout this entire video, but this table is all of the detail that shows up here on the right-hand side of the screen. So this shows every single hand in my overall range. Right now, I have this ranked by equity, but as we kind of work our way through, you can see how it's the data within here shows a little bit different information here. So it's ranked all by equity. This column here is the combos and how the combos break out across my different strategic options. So using this example here, 10 of diamonds, 10 of clubs, it's our highest equity hand. The solver chooses to mix this as it is with every other hand, putting 0.065 combos, so 6.5% of the combos in the large bet range, just under 40% or 0.397 combos in the medium-sized betting range, and then a little over 50% or 53% or 0.537 combos in the checking range. And so on and so forth. We can see that from a combo standpoint. If I click this second bar, percentages, this just shows the same exact breakout, but just based off of the percentage coverage of each of those. And then finally, the third one is Eevee, which is somewhat more interesting. It shows based on each of those strategic frequencies, what are the EVs that I can expect to, or I shouldn't say expect to earn, but what's the overall EV of each of these individual hands against our opponent's entire range with each of these individual hands. I'll go back to combos. The second bar here lets me look at the entire decision, or I can break it out by any one of these individual strategic frequencies. So suppose I only wanted to look at what does my range that bets large look like. This is where the display method 2 kind of looks a little bit, it's kind of hard to tell. If I do all at 100, I can see that, basically my entire range, at least some portion of my entire range is put into this large bet size, even though it's only 4% of my overall range. The smaller bet size, you can kind of see a little bit more easily here, and how the solver chooses to bet the smaller bet size in my overall range. And then the checking range, what does that look like as well too? So again, this is a good way of just looking at this entire node on the game tree. As I move through the game tree, so let's say I look at the scenario where we bet 1/3 pot and I go to my opponent's action, we can go down and we can see that the rest of this screen is essentially the same. The differences here are the details, the data. So now we can see, so this box is updated a little bit. So now the pot is no longer 6.5. We've put in a bet of 2.15. So the pot is 8.65. Our opponent still has a 97.5 big blind stack, but he now has 2.14 to call, and he's getting 4-1 odds. So some of these, he's getting great odds, and we can actually see that the solver chooses to essentially never fold. So, the red is the fold, and there's not a lot of red. They're essentially folding weak ace X, and King Jack here, and some of the weaker pocket pairs, but essentially everything else is either put into a call or a raise. So it's raising 18% of hands, calling 68% of hands, and only folding 15% of hands. So one of the things that I think of when I first look at this is, if this is what an equilibrium response is supposed to look like, is my opponent actually playing in this way? So are they actually raising 18% of hands? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, I think they are likely raising, at least a good portion of their 10s, 8s, 4s, 10-8 suited. And then some of the obvious draws like, Jack 9, 9-7 with the gut shots there. They might be raising hands like Ace 10, but are they really going to be raising, King Queen offsuit here against us? Are they going to be raising, some of the weaker, hands like King Jack suited, right? So are they going to be raising Ace 9 suited? These are things that we might want to start thinking of. Is our opponent going to be raising at this frequency? Are they going to be calling at this frequency? Are they going to be calling with pocket deuces? Are they going to be calling with Ace 3 suited, right? So these are things that we're going to also want to think through is if our opponent's not going to be defending at this level, so if they're defending way less than this, well, then maybe we can be actually changing our strategy to bet more or bet a larger sizing. If they're going to be defending through calls or raises way more often, then we may have to adjust things in the other way. But this is where you want to start calibrating based off of the things in which you actually think you see or observe in the overall player pool, and compare them to the overall equilibrium response as you're starting to develop some of your strategies. The other things to note here is all of the different components here. So we saw that in the first part here, we're making 3.2 big blinds. Villain's only making 3.3. Once we bet, now the villain, this is from the perspective of player 2, is making 2.52 big blinds, and we are the villain in this case. We are making almost 4 big blinds. And the reason is that this is all recalculated at the point of this individual node. So once we put in a bet, we're only doing this with 31% of our range. We've narrowed our range a little bit, and we're doing this with a stronger portion of our range. We're naturally going to have more equity available to us within that range. Our opponents now is going to be earning less. So their EV is 2.52. One thing it's useful to note is that our opponent is going to make 3.3 big blinds overall. That's going to be the average of all of these. So in this point here, they're making 2.52 big blinds. In this larger node here, they're making 2.15 big blinds. But when we check to them, they're making 3.75 big blinds. So the 2/3 of the time that we're checking to them, now they're earning much larger portion of the pot because, and all of this averages out overall to this 3.3 big blinds. All right, so this is essentially what every single node in the tree looks like, and this is how you might look at all the different data within the components of these nodes. The last thing I want to cover as it relates to this specific output of GTO Plus and just the overall how to interpret this data in general is starting to look at turn reports and river reports, because I think it's a very, very useful function in here as you're actually analyzing this. So let's say we're analyzing a spot and we bet the smaller sizing and our opponent calls. And we want to see what do we do on, I'm just going to pick a really good turn for us. So let's just call it a Badoogie, like King of Spades turn. So when we get to this point here, one, it's just going to take us straight to the turn. And we can see that, yeah, this is a great turn for us. We're only checking 14% of the time, and we're betting, for the most part, this 66% pot sizing, but some larger, some smaller. We're betting a lot of our range here. I could hit this circle button here, and what this is actually going to do is it's going to refine the solve a little bit more from this point forward. And it's going to just give us a little bit more accuracy. The numbers don't change significantly, so this 14% goes down to 13.1%, but it's just going to refine this a little bit more and get us a little bit more accuracy with this. And that's great. I can go through this same exact process I went through on the flop and actually look at the equilibriums on what the equilibrium strategy looks like on various turns. But from what I find is that the further and further you find yourself going down the rabbit hole of individual tree analyses, the further detached you get from actually analyzing the problem that you came to analyze in the first place. So if we spent a lot of time here on the flop building out a flop construction study, it's going to be we're gonna have less clarity over what our own strategy looks like as we continue going down that path, and way less strategy over how our opponent is going to respond. So what I find is actually way more useful than just going through one individual turn card is looking at turn reports. So what I can do is I can first click on these turn reports, and you see it's going to take me to this screen, and it's going to show me all of the different turn cards that could come. And that's where I think the real value comes into play here. We can look at this from our perspective or the other player's perspective, so player 1 or player 2. We can also look at this with the perspective of our entire range that we go into the turn with. And again, this is not our overall range of these ranges. It's the overall range that we chose to bet 1/3 pot and our opponent called. So when that specifically happens, we can see what our EV looks like across all different turn cards. And perhaps not very surprisingly, we can see that the overcards to the board, so hands like cards like aces, kings, queens, are really good for us. And they're going to generate a good amount of EV for us. The low cards to the board are also fairly good for us. So 4s, 3s, and deuces, they're bricks, and they're going to generate some EV for us as well too. And then these middle cards, jacks are kind of in this neutral bucket, and same thing with these low cards as well too. But anything between a 10 and a 5 is kind of a bad card for us, and that's where our EV is going to dip considerably. I have this looking at from an EV perspective, but we can click on any one of these buttons, and now we can kind of see this from an equity standpoint. So how does this look like from an equity standpoint for each of these individual turn cards? I also like doing it from this perspective. So my checking, I like looking at the checking frequency, and we can kind of see, okay, now the red, while we might think the red is bad, actually the red is good in this scenario here, because when a king rolls off, we're essentially never checking this. We're checking this 17, 16, 14% of the time. When these middling cards come, so 10s, 9s, 7s, 6s, we're checking them at equilibrium 50+% of the time. So again, a cool way of actually just visualizing the different turn cards that can come and what the equilibrium response looks like. It doesn't tell you exactly what you should be doing, but what it does give you a good sense of is, at a high level, what are the turn cards that are really good for my range? What are the turn cards that are not so good for my range and better for my opponent's range? And it gives you a good North Star to build your strategy off of. Because once you have a really good sense of how different cards affect your overall range, you can align just overall guidance around how you might be constructing double barrel ranges, how you might be constructing, which hands you might start turning into shifting into realization. So there are different ways in which you can actually construct, and a lot of those ways are founded on understanding how different cards interact with both your range and your opponent's range. So that's actually this icon right here. This one shows it essentially the same way, but I never look at this one, this bar graph view. It's the same view. It's just I don't find that it actually tells us very much, and I don't think it's that interesting for me. Again, if I do it from an EV perspective, it does nicely show that, like, okay, kings have the highest EVs, and, like, you know, aces and queens are somewhat comparable, along with like fours and, you know, to a lesser degree threes and deuces. You know, and then some of these are worse cards are worse for our overall EV. But I never necessarily like spend much time actually looking at this view. I do like looking at this view, which is this shows the distribution of our turn actions for every turn. So you can start seeing that, okay, the pink represents the middle bet size, the blue represents the small bet size, and then the dark blue represents a large bet size. We're not really betting large that often unless it's a Badoogie, like, you know, king here is a really great card for us. Queen here is a really great card for us. So some of these Badoogie cards are really great for us. We can actually start going off with a really polarized portion of our range. We also don't really bet this small size that much, other than when we, you know, see tens, as well as a little bit of the aces in our range. But for the most part, we're just betting this 2/3 pot size at equilibrium, and, you know, on the cards that are really good for us, so jacks, queens, kings definitely, and aces, as well as these low cards, fours, threes, and deuces, we continue at a higher frequency. These middling cards, there's a lot more green here, so we're checking at a higher frequency. So again, this is just a good way of helping to visualize the cards that are really good for our range versus the cards that are not so good for our range. And then finally, this last view here is this graph view again here, so we can start seeing these turn cards and, you know, what these turn cards represent in terms of the overall EV for our range, equity for our range, etc. And we could do the same types of things as actually measuring this from, you know, equity versus EV if we wanted to, and, you know, you can kind of play around with this and see how you actually want to visualize this too. You can look at this and see what it looks like for player 1 and player 2. Player 2 is not going to have any strategic actions because it's going to be dependent on whatever we choose to do here. So it's really, from a player 2 perspective, all they're going to look at here is what is the overall turn, and then the equity and EV. However, if I do choose one of these actions, then I can look at the player 2 responses, which is, I think, a cool way of actually actually looking at this across the entire turn game tree. We can see the different responses that our opponents might have as a result of after we choose to take certain actions. And then finally, the specific hand. I can pick a specific hand. So let's say I do have the 10 of clubs, 10 of diamonds. I'm just... things freezing up on me. There we go. So 10 of clubs, 10 of diamonds. I can see specifically what which I choose that, and that's the best possible hand I really can have. The only really bad turns for me here in this spot are like 7s and 9s, because they're going to create and then even to maybe a little bit lesser of a degree, like 7s and to a little lesser degree, jacks, because these guys are going to create some straights that could potentially like beat us. But hands that any other hands that pop out, we're really gonna, or cards that pop out, we're gonna be in great shape with pocket tens. We can do this with any other card in our range. So if you have actually a specific hand that you want to see how that hand interacts with different turn cards, you can do so by actually looking at those specific hands as well too. So that's essentially the output of a GTO plus solve. The rest of this, and as we get through turns, we can do rivers, and the river reports look exactly the same way. So, and you can see this automatically solves a little bit here in this spot. But the river reports are going to look exactly the same thing as turn reports, mainly because the rest of the outputs are really essentially just carbon copies of one another. They're just using the different data available based at that point in the individual game tree. So to wrap up, I hope this was helpful as you're jumping into GTO Plus, and as you're trying to navigate your way through actually running solves and interpreting those outputs, hopefully you're able to get some ideas for the types of things that you should be looking for, how to actually interpret a lot of the data that comes out, because I know that there is a lot of that data that comes out of GTO Plus, and sometimes it's not necessarily all that clear how to make sense of it. So, hopefully this has been helpful, and hopefully that you'll be able to take this and run with a lot of your own analyses and start looking at different spots or different trees that you might set up within GTO Plus. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, feel free to leave them. If you're watching this on YouTube, in the comments below, make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the follow button. You'll get a notification anytime I put new videos up. If you are looking at this on my website, make sure that you, if you have any comments, leave any comments below. If you have any questions, reach out to me anytime. Always happy to discuss or answer any questions about any of the work I'm doing. And for those of you who are looking at this on YouTube, make sure you check out my website, lukic.io. I do a lot of cool work specifically around the data side of No Limit Hold'em. So again, thanks again for joining me today. And over the next couple weeks, I will put out a third part for how to use GTO Plus within this series, where I'm going to explore the more exploitative side of building strategies, by specifically focusing on node locking and how do we actually use node locking to develop those strategies a little bit further. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and thanks again. Have a great day.